Thank you everyone for joining us for the webinar on management of first line ovarian cancer. Now I would like to hand it over to our program director, Dr. Satish, CT, medical oncologist from Bangalore. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. After a long time, we know that we are somehow virtually connected to each other. Some of the meetings are here and there. This is today we are talking about the first line management of ovarian cancer. I request Dr. Shekhar Patil sir and Poonam Patil. I'll request Dr. Shekhar Patil to have a opening remarks. Then I'll have a overview of the ovarian cancer, just a brief, 5 to 10 minutes. Then next speaker, I think we are going to announce next. I request Dr. Shekhar Patil sir to have a yes.
Thank you, Dr. Satish. Are you able to hear, Satish?
Yes, we can able to hear
it. Yeah. Basically, it is first of all, thanks for this invitation, and we will be having today discussion is on the management of the first line ovarian cancer. What is new? All these years, we are for the last 3 decades, we are struck with paclitaxel carboplatin combination. And only in the last few years, only the bevacizumab was added to the first line with marginal improvement in the PFS, not with a significant improvement in the OS. But of late, with better understanding about the HRD genes, and because of that one, we are having a newer drugs like PARP inhibitors, so that have come up in a big way in the first line, and which is showing a significant improvement in the PFS and overall survival in this group of patients. That is particularly in the first line, particularly if you have got a patient who have got a germline mutation of HRD gene, or it may be somatic mutations in the BRCA gene, or it can be even a platinum sensitive patients can respond to the PARP inhibitors in the maintenance treatment, so that which can extend or prolong the disease-free survival in this group of patients. So that is the basic idea of this today's meeting. What is new in the first line, which will help us to get patients in a longer disease-free survival, is what we are going to discuss today. And for this, we have got a very good speakers, Dr. Ravi, Dr. Prasad, Dr. Rahul, and after that, very interesting panel discussions will be by Dr. Amit, so that it will be interesting discussion on the first line. I think it is over to you, Madam Dr. Poonam, Madam, if you are few words for the meeting.
No, as you rightly said, now ovarian cancer has become like a chronic illness even otherwise, but for first line, we didn't have many options. Now with knowledge of molecular markers, biomarkers, ovarian cancer is again going to improve in its actionable drugs and utility, and we'll have longer progression-free survival and disease-free survival. So today's talk is important in that aspect, that we have newer drugs now for first line.
So it is over to you, Dr. Satish. You can give the overview of the ovarian cancer.
Satish, you are muted.
Satish, sir, you'll have to unmute your mic. Sir, can you hear me? You'll have to unmute your mic, sir.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. We heard about Dr. Shekhar Patil sir and Poonam madam regarding the overall the importance of today meeting. I'm having a few slides regarding the overview of ovarian cancer. It is one of the most common cancer in women in India. It is a more common disease of post-menopausal women. Still, despite we use I used to see in the clinical practicing, people are coming in a younger age. Most of the patients, they'll present with the advanced stage, most likely the stage 3, stage 4. This is what we see clinical practice. We know that still we try to go for a curative treatment in every stage. Like we know that if you have patient coming in the first stage and second stage, we can have a curative intent of almost like 60 to 90%. But when coming to the stage 3 and stage 4, the curative potential will come down, ranging from like 10% to like 20 to 30%. Depending on how they respond treatment, the biology of the disease is important in each individual. Coming to the like stage 1 and 2, we don't have any controversial upfront surgery. Like with based on the imaging and tumor marker, will try to go for a debulking surgery based on the post of this histopathology. All the thing, we'll try to go for the adjuvant treatment. Like this is the like when they're coming for the like advanced stage, like coming to stage 3 and stage 4. There's a question is whether you have to go for surgery or chemotherapy in some of the indication, the neoadjuvant, and we'll try to go in some few cases. We'll try to most of the patient will try to go for debulking surgery. We'll try to go for optimal debulking. Mainly surgeon role is important. What we are like, we want to change the biological disease in the patient means if the patient done underwent a proper optimal debulking surgery, is going to tell is a platinum sensitive or not. It is one of the first important thing. The next is second is the like what we are having a tumor like the genetic nature, the BRCA and HRD gene. The other thing is response to treatment. The three important factor is important in the overview of response treatment, prolonging the life and even curative intention. Like if you don't have like a debulking properly, they'll try to recur faster and try to have even they'll try to become platinum resistant. They'll try to progress very faster. Some of the patient will try to go for neoadjuvant treatment. Like then they try to go those who are not fit for upfront surgery. Then if there are some of the few cases, they may become progressive and they can go for second line treatment like that. Like rationally, I'm not going in depth actually because like the surgeon role is main important in this case. Like we'll try to go for a remove the what are the upfront surgery means some of the patient they're having they may not sensitive to chemo, some mucinate type, some of the thing. The necrotic tumor is there. They're having poor blood supply in the central necrotic area. Try to debulk as much as possible. Which is the remnant some viable cells. They'll try to become more active to respond to cytotoxic chemotherapy. This is the rationale for upfront debulking surgery adjunct treatment. But these are most likely the practice most of the institution, except some few incidents like that will try to go for a neoadjuvant. They are like induction chemotherapy, like try to like they're not able to debulk optimally. They're in a stage 4. They're like the physical performance status is not fit for surgery. Try to go for neoadjuvant treatment. This is like practice day to day. Like this is like I'm telling you what are the indication like neoadjuvant is like stage 4 malignant pleural effusion, extensive peritoneal disease in especially mesentery bowel surface involvement and gallbladder fluid, like photohepatitis, ligamentaires, anything that they're involved extensively. They're for GC. These are cases we'll try to go for the neoadjuvant treatment. It varies from in the institution. If like the surgery done doing from the multiple institutes is different in others. I think we are people day-to-day practice all those things. They are different on the surgeon. All those things is main important. And like there's so much of randomized studies are there. There is no much difference. Those are like those are upfront neoadjuvant followed by like there's a debate is there. They try to have a near equivalent long-term outcome. Those who underwent a surgery first debulk surgery later adjuvant or neoadjuvant later surgery. Still like some of the few cases controversy all those things there, but most like they try to have a equivalent. Like there is improvement debulking rate if they are not fit for that and coming from a 25 to 85% in this published in the AM study. Definitely is going to improve the quality of life. Neoadjuvant pill is not a routine practice. Like those are not fit for. I told you those are the indication try to go for the. Conclusion, like whenever like feasible controversial scenario, like it will have a definitely it should have a multidisciplinary team to discuss between the like surgical oncologist and medical oncologist to decide which one to go, all those things. That's like definitely the improved like the common drugs is like I'm not going back because the next coming speaker is going to talk. Like next is like along with the cytotoxic, like there's a lot of evolution that happened, platinum taxanes later, like addition of those dense like weekly taxanes has come as show the improvement in response, and even some of the Japanese studies they have tried to have a progression piece, and even oral surrogate has improved. And HIPEC is one of the thing that has shown that improvement in the outcome when combined with the what a current day-to-day practice should be done in like those are commonly it explains like those are practicing that one. And this is like what we are doing first, like surgery and adjuvant treatment, try to like prolong as much as possible without recurrence. So if you try to maintain that, they try to respond like second line, third line, they'll try to have a, like if this duration comes between the first treatment to the second, the first relapse, that is the most important factor deciding. The newer approaches are like target therapy is coming, VEGF. Like this is one of the things, like I'm not going depth actually. These are like they try to improve the, along with the cytotoxic, try to improve the that in antigenic pathway, try to improve that. This is like there's some showing that by adding the addition of antigenic drug bevacizumab along with the cytotoxic drug, there are various studies are there. I'm not going in depth. Like, definitely is shown an improvement in the trend. Anything else later, like it is there, like BRCA mutation there, like it has shown that definitely improvement is like kind of HRD gene, like that is they're coming, and newer thing, even immunotherapy in some subtypes, not all the variant of ovarian cancer. Like most important thing is early suspicion, and prompt like investigation has to do wherever like a genetic test is required. Like then also like try to correct the diagnosis. If you're having initial diagnosis early stage, we'll try to have a longer like survival rate. And PARP inhibitor definitely is having a promising role. And addition to the like what are the try to improve the prolong the survival. The first step is towards this. The mission is successful cancer treatment whenever possible. First treatment is the best treatment. Try to avoid as much as possible delay the recurrence. This is the thing. Next, I'll try to request speaker like Dr. Ravi Devakar sir. Try to speak about the like current chemotherapy protocol in cancer and ovarian cancer treatment as a first line treatment.
Ravi sir, do you want us to share the slides?
Yeah, I'll see if I can share.
Sure, sir. Sure, sir. Please go.
It's visible?
So not yet. Currently, we are seeing the Zoom screen, sir. Sir.
Is it visible now?
So not yet, sir.
Okay,
I can still see the, yeah.
You
sure,
share this thing.
Sure, sir. I'll just share.
Okay. Okay, can I start?
Yes, sir.
Okay, next slide. Thank you, Dr. Satish, for an invitation to this webinar. Without much ado, we'll just proceed with this thing. So we know that carcinoma of the ovary has got a presence majorly in the stage 3 and stage 4. And with whatever this thing that we have got, the survival rate is less than 50%, and it is just about 20% in stage 4 cancers. Next slide. And surgery with complete or optimal cytoreduction and chemotherapy are the main side effects in the management of epithelial ovarian cancer. And the standard approach to treatment for women requiring first-line chemotherapy for epithelial ovarian cancer is to use a platinum agent with a taxane. And this has been born with these protocols, with these trials. Next slide. Early ovarian cancer management. Approximately 25% of the women will be diagnosed with early stage ovarian cancer, either confined to the ovary or to the pelvis. And these women with early epithelial ovarian cancer confined to the ovary, stage 1A or 1B, or well-differentiated tumors, the prognosis is excellent, and with surgery alone and almost to the tune of 90%. So for all others, adjuvant therapy is recommended. This group of patients, stage 1A, 1B, grade 1 tumors with good prognosis with surgery alone, chemotherapy is not recommended. Next slide. Chemotherapy is recommended for stage 1C tumors and stage 2 tumors where the tumor is involving the pelvis. And for clear cell histology, any stage, and a high-grade tumor, that is a grade 3 tumor, where otherwise the survival rate ranges from 40 to 80%. In grade 2 tumors, there is a controversy whether chemotherapy has to be given, and it should be considered as high-risk disease and offered adjuvant therapy. But especially in certain histologies such as endometrial or serous histology, if there has been a complete optimal debulking has been done, complete removal of the tumor has been done, chemotherapy can be skipped in grade 2 ovarian cancer stage 1. And next slide. Now, there are 5 randomized trials conducted between 1990 and 2003 involving 1,277 women. And in that, they said the adjuvant therapy associated with benefit both in PFS and OS. However, in patients with no gross residual disease following surgery, chemotherapy did not improve overall survival and when compared with observation. Whereas in incompletely resected disease, chemotherapy resulted in superior overall survival when compared with observation. And women with high-risk tumors had a survival advantage with the use of adjuvant chemotherapy. Next slide. There's another trial called the ACTION trial where 448 women were randomized with early epithelial ovarian cancer and high-risk features. And in this, with a median follow-up of 10 years, complete surgical staging, there was no significant improvement in either relapse-free survival or cancer-specific survival. But incomplete surgical staging, there was a definite improvement in both the relapse-free survival and cancer-specific survival. Next stage. Excuse me, I think the slides are going down. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Okay. So adjuvant therapy in early stage epithelial ovarian cancer is typically given between 21 and 35 days after the primary debulking surgery. And there's some evidence that survival may be worsened if it is beyond 35 days. And for such women, adjuvant intravenous chemotherapy is the preferred modality. And treatment with platinum-based doublet, that paclitaxel and carboplatin, is generally prescribed, and it's basically derived from what we have seen in advanced stage epithelial ovarian cancers. Next. Then comes this thing as to how many cycles to give, whether 3 or 6 cycles. GOG 157 addressed these issues. And here, when compared with 3 cycles, administration of 6 cycles was associated with a non-significant trend towards low risk of recurrence and a similar 5-year survival rate, but no toxicity. But it has shown that in patients with serous carcinoma and where patients had other high-risk features, giving 6 cycles may be beneficial. So the recommendation is now to at least give 3 cycles and assess the patient for tolerance to treatment. If there is minimal toxicity, then subsequent cycles to a maximum of 6 cycles can be given, provided the patient is tolerating the treatment well. Next. Clear cell carcinomas have a poor responses to platinum-based chemotherapy compared to serous carcinomas and the lower duration of overall survival. And they don't respond well at all, and their prognosis is poor. So there are some clinical trials going on where they have used temsirolimus with carboplatin and paclitaxel in the GOG 268 trial. And sunitinib is being tried, especially in recurrent disease. Next. Sometimes early stage epithelial ovarian cancer diagnosis is made during surgery for an emergency, like in a torsion or doing a cystectomy, and they would not have undergone a surgical staging and have to be considered to have apparent early but unstaged ovarian cancer. In these situations, staging is the recommended treatment because both prognosis and adjuvant treatment options are tied up with the disease stage. And this can be performed through a minimally invasive approach. However, next slide. There is some evidence that suggests surgery may not be required if adjuvant chemotherapy is administered. There was a retrospective study of 88 patients with early stage ovarian cancer, where 36 were unstaged, and there was no difference in outcome among the women who underwent staging or those who did not undergo staging. There's another series of 138 patients in which 53 underwent adjuvant therapy, 34 after staging and 19 without staging, and the relapse rate for medium follow-up was 58 months without any difference. So in a situation where you have a clinically and in the initial stage, you know that it could be a epithelial ovarian cancer, early stage, and patient for whatever reason refuses surgery, again a staging procedure, or cannot be done, maybe you can go ahead with adjuvant chemotherapy if you are convinced that it is an early stage disease. Next slide. Adjuvant intraperitoneal chemotherapy for early stage disease is experimental and is being evaluated in clinical trials, so it's not the current protocol of treatment. Next slide. Early stage post-adjuvant therapy observation is the norm as of now. There is no role for maintenance therapy. However, in BRCA-associated ovarian cancers, we can offer, that is, it may be a BRCA-associated ovarian cancer, can be either somatic or a germline mutation, can offer maintenance therapy with PARP inhibitor, particularly for stage 2 disease. And this is basically extrapolated from the PFS benefit seen in advanced stage disease. I think Dr. Prasad will speak in more detail about these issues. Next slide. Now coming to the advanced ovarian cancer, which is the more common disease which we see. Here again, complete resection of all macroscopic disease has shown to be the single most important independent prognostic factor. So upfront debulking surgery with resection of all macroscopic disease and acceptable operative mortality followed by carboplatin paclitaxel is the present standard of care. And to know whether an upfront debulking surgery can be done definitely or not, you need to do a proper diagnostic workup, including a CT or a PET CT scan or an MRI scan or a diagnostic laparoscopy, whichever is feasible, whichever can give the maximum information has to be used. Next slide. However, if optimal upfront debulking surgery cannot be achieved due to any of these things that have been written here, and as told by Dr. Satish, a neoadjuvant chemotherapy can be considered, followed by interval debulking surgery. Next slide. So EORTC 55971 and CHORUS trials were performed in receiving neoadjuvant chemotherapy followed by interval debulking surgery compared with upfront debulking surgery. And it showed similar PFS and OS between the both either interval debulking or upfront debulking. However, in both these studies, the percentage of patients undergoing upfront debulking surgery was very low, only about 20%. So there's another trial going on called the TRUST trial, in which there is a strict qualification process for the participating centers regarding upfront debulking surgery and planning for neoadjuvant chemotherapy, selecting patients for neoadjuvant chemotherapy. And the results are awaited. Next slide. Now for optimally debulked disease, that is who have less than 1 centimeter of residual disease or complete debulking has been done, there are two options of treatment. Either I have an intravenous chemotherapy or a combination of intravenous and intraperitoneal chemotherapy. For women with suboptimally reduced disease, that is if they have a residual disease of more than 1 centimeter, they are not candidates for intraperitoneal chemotherapy and should receive only IV treatment. In a 2006 meta-analysis of 60 trials, including 15,600 patients with epithelial ovarian cancer advanced stage, platinum and taxane combination improved the survival when compared with platinum monotherapy or a platinum plus a non-taxane combination. Hence, platinum taxane combination has become the standard of care. Next slide. Now, coming to the role of intraperitoneal chemotherapy post-optimal debulking, there are 2-3 trials which have been done where in a GOG 172 trial, they did IV paclitaxel plus cisplatin compared with IV paclitaxel plus IV cisplatin and IP intraperitoneal cisplatin and paclitaxel. In this, only about 42% of the patients in the intraperitoneal arm completed all the 6 cycles of assigned therapy. But in spite of it, the IV-IP group experienced better progression-free survival than in the IV group, and the median survival also was better. But the quality of life was worse in the intraperitoneal group, even during and soon after the treatment, up to a year. Post 1 year, the quality of life seemed to improve. Next. There was another trial called the GOG 252 trials, where it was randomized into 3 arms, where you had a dose-dense IV chemotherapy arm, where paclitaxel and carboplatin, paclitaxel was administered weekly and carboplatin every 3 weeks. Then you had a IV IP arm with carboplatin IP and IV paclitaxel plus cisplatin and paclitaxel intraperitoneal arm. And in this trial, bevacizumab was used in all the arms. But when you see in this trial, the progression-free survival and the median overall survival in all the three arms were comparable, whether it was dose dense or whether it was IV carboplatin or IV pacli plus cisplatin with bevacizumab. All the progression-free survival and median overall survival were the same. And for stage 2 and stage 3 disease with no residual disease, overall survival was 99 months with IV carboplatin, about 105 months with IV intraperitoneal carboplatin, and about and it was not reached in the intraperitoneal cisplatin arm. Next slide. But the problem was there were a lot of toxicity like neurotoxicity, abdominal discomfort, myelosuppression, nephrotoxicity, hepatotoxicity, GI toxicity, all involving impacting the quality of life. And it was particularly bad in patients who received intraperitoneal cisplatin. So what is the recommendation is you have an option of IV and IV intraperitoneal chemotherapy, and it should be discussed with all patients who have advanced epithelial ovarian cancer with no residual disease or in those with residual tumor less than 1 centimeter after upfront debulking surgery or post interval debulking surgery after a neoadjuvant chemotherapy. And if the patient accepts, you should offer it to them, offer intraperitoneal therapy to them. For patients in whom bevacizumab is not planned as an upfront treatment or a maintenance treatment, IVIP treatment may be beneficial. But where bevacizumab is planned upfront, IV therapy is preferred because in that trial, all three arms showed that there was no difference in survival. Next slide. Now, again, there is a growing interest in the use of HIPEC for epithelial ovarian cancer, and the early data is quite encouraging. Now, there are two trials. One is a multi-open label phase 3 trial called the OV-HIPEC, in which patients were randomized to either upfront HIPEC or no HIPEC. And HIPEC was done with using cisplatin 100 milligrams per meter square. And in this, there was a significantly longer PFS and overall survival without increasing the toxicity. But the criticism of this trial was all stage 4 patients were excluded, and only a very small group of epithelial ovarian cancer patients with advanced disease fulfilled their criteria for inclusion. And with this led to slow recruitment. And hence they said difficult to extrapolate all these results to all patients of advanced disease. And overall survival was not a primary or a co-primary endpoint. And the small study bias can probably induce a bias and give an explanation for the longer PFS and OS seen in this trial. Next slide. There's another trial which was presented in ASCO 2017, where stage 3 and 4 ovarian cancers were randomly allocated to HIPEC or to a control arm. And in this trial, it did not show any statistical superiority of the HIPEC arm compared to only chemotherapy arm. Next slide. So the major concerns presently about HIPEC approach in these cancers in first-line ovarian cancer is there is an inherent potential morbidity. The longer post-operative recovery time may result in a delay, decreased dose density, or even withdrawal from subsequent systemic chemotherapy. So outside of a clinical trial, HIPEC as a first-line treatment is not recommended at present. Next slide. Now coming to IV conventional versus dose dense therapy. Now there are again 3 to 4 trials examining this modality, where a first trial is the ICON trial, where 1,600 patients. This is predominantly a European-based trial, where 6 cycles of standard 3-week dosing was compared with once weekly carboplatin and dose-dense paclitaxel versus both weekly carboplatin and paclitaxel. That is, both were given weekly. And here the PFS was similar in all the 3 arms, and there was no difference in the progression-free survival. And there was a higher toxicity in the dose-dense arms. Next slide. This is another Japanese GOG trial where 631 women were randomized to either 3 weekly carboplatin or 3-weekly carboplatin plus weekly paclitaxel, and there's a median follow-up of 77 months. This trial showed that there was a significant improvement in progression-free survival and the overall survival. And this was best seen in women with at least 1 centimeter of residual disease following surgical cytoreduction, and serous and other histologic subtypes. The dose-dense therapy improved the progression-free survival. This did not show an improvement when the patient had an optimal debulking or less than 1 centimeter residual disease or no disease was present post surgery. Next slide. So, but in this trial, in the JGOG trial, there was a treatment discontinuation for toxicity. It was higher in the dose-dense arm. And again, at least one treatment cycle was delayed because of toxicity in the dose-dense arm. Next slide. There is another trial called GOG 262 trial, where they randomized patients to either conventionally dosed carboplatin paclitaxel versus dose-dense carboplatin paclitaxel, and bevacizumab was administration was optional in these arms. And however, 84% of the patients in this trial received bevacizumab. When you look at the whole group as a whole, the entire group of patients, at a medium follow-up of 28 months, there was no difference in progression-free survival and between the dose-dense and the conventionally dosed. But when you look at the only chemotherapy arm, that is patient who received chemotherapy but no bevacizumab, we find that there was a prolonged progression-free survival compared with the conventional dosing. Among patients who received both chemotherapy and bevacizumab, the progression-free survival was the same between the two groups. So this showed that bevacizumab, if you are using bevacizumab, probably dose-dense chemotherapy may not be beneficial. You can use a conventional dose paclicarbo. Next slide. There's yet another trial called the METO7 trial, where again it used compared the conventional this thing with a weekly schedule of paclitaxel and carboplatin. Here the point to note is the paclitaxel dose, which is 60 milligrams per meter square, which is about 20% less compared to the paclitaxel dose in the other dose-dense arms. So this is on a lesser dose, this thing. And with this, it showed that the progression-free survival at a median follow-up of 22 months was the same. And there was no difference in the probability of survival, overall survival at 24 months. And because of the lower dose of paclitaxel, there were lower rates of serious neutropenia, febrile neutropenia, thrombocytopenia, neurotoxicity, etc. Next slide. So with all this in mind, what has the trials of dose-dense versus conventional paclitaxel carboplatin has shown is that the trial have a similar or improved efficacy with dose-dense compared to conventional dosed therapy, though toxicities are typically higher. But if you used a modified dose-dense regimen like the METO7 trial, where there was a lower dose of paclitaxel every week, then it may be used. It can be used probably even in medically frail patients. And mucinous or clear cell carcinoma patients do not appear to benefit from the dose-dense trial. That is what came out. And when bevacizumab is administered, it is generally administered with a conventionally dosed regimen. Next slide. Now coming to the newer molecules, I'm not going to present in detail because I think Dr. Prasad is going to talk about it. However, mutation in a BRCA1 or BRCA2 or with a HRD situation, maintenance therapy is recommended in first line with a PARP inhibitor. And this is basically based on observation of a PARP inhibitor as maintenance therapy, which demonstrate a progression-free survival advantage, even in women without BRCA1 and BRCA2 mutation in some trials. And the benefit is best seen in patients who have mutation. Then the next level of benefit is seen in patients who have a HRD. And even without either of these, if there are platinum sensitive patients, you may have a modest benefit if used in first line maintenance. Next slide. Now coming to bevacizumab, again, bevacizumab has been added to conventionally dosed IV chemotherapy and as maintenance in first line in patients without a known mutation BRCA1 or 2, or in patients who have a high risk of recurrence, that is those with large effusions or ascites. And the evidence for these comes in the form of these two trials, ICON 7 and ICON 218. In ICON 218, the dose was about 15 milligrams per kg and given every 3 weeks for up to 21 weeks, 21 cycles. In ICON 7, it was 7.5 milligrams per kg given every 3 weeks for up to 18 doses. And in both of them, it showed a almost similar progression-free survival, but there was no overall survival benefit. Next slide. Now, what about bevacizumab with neoadjuvant chemotherapy? There are two small randomized controlled trials called the Antalya and the GECO 1005 NOVA. In the Antalya trial, there was no improvement in either, they did not see an improvement in either survival, progression-free or overall survival, but the complete resection rate was higher with addition of bevacizumab as compared with conventional this thing. And in the GECO trial, though it did not show a clinical benefit in complete macroscopic response, but it showed that the rate of surgical operability was higher. And there were similar safety profiles with no increase in toxicity compared to the paclitaxel carboplatin. So it could be an option to be used in certain patients along with neoadjuvant chemotherapy. However, if you are using bevacizumab, you should see to it that you have at least a 6-week interval before surgery and 6-week interval after surgery when you don't use bevacizumab. That is important to avoid problems of post-op problems of wound healing, fistulas, etc. Next slide. Now, there are some small molecules like pasopanib, which have been used in maintenance trial. There is one trial called the AGO-OR16 trial, where it showed that there is a significant improvement in progression-free survival, but in an interim survival analysis, no corresponding improvement in overall survival was seen. Next slide. There's another molecule called nintedanib, which is a tyrosine kinase inhibitor against VEGF, FGF, and PDGF. Here also it showed a modestly improved progression-free survival, but it is generally not recommended in any of the guidelines. Next slide. A word about low-grade serous carcinoma of the ovary. Here, primary debulking surgery to an extent of no macroscopic residual disease or even up to less than 1 centimeter is very important because these are tumors which have very low chemosensitivity. Even then, paclitaxel carboplatin is the standard of care, and addition of bevacizumab should be considered. And in most of these patients, they have high ER and PR expression, and maintenance anti-estrogen therapy can be considered. There are a couple of trials, I think, using MEK2 inhibitors in advanced or recurrent low-grade serous ovarian carcinomas. Maybe it takes time for us to see whether it is generally going to be useful. Next slide. Thank you for all your patient hearing. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for an excellent presentation about the complete. I think you have gone through all the extensive protocol. I think most of them got revised with all the thing what you read in PG days. It was very nice, sir. It was very excellent. Thank you, sir. And I request Dr. Prasad Narayan, Senior Medical Oncologist from Sidecare Hospital, to deliver the next talk on target therapy in ovarian cancer first line, including PARP inhibitor.
Thank you. So after that excellent talk by Dr. Ravi Divakar, which actually covered the ovarian cancer treatment in entirety, my job is very specific. I'll be speaking about the 2 trials which have established the role of olaparib specifically. Next slide, please, in the treatment of ovarian cancer. So the 2 trials which I'll be speaking will be the SOLO-1 trial, which looked at olaparib specifically in tumor BRCA mutant ovarian cancer patients, and then the PAOLA-1 study, which looked at all ovarian cancer patients, and it had a comparison with bevacizumab as well. Next slide, please. So this we have already discussed. Ovarian cancer remains a difficult disease with all the target therapies that we have. We have a 5-year survival rate of 38%, which needs a lot of improvement. Next slide, please. And this is the typical lifeline of a ovarian cancer patient, and it still continues despite having all PARP inhibitors and bevacizumab. We have chemotherapy as the skeleton of treatment in ovarian cancer in majority of our patients still. Next slide, please. So we'll go to the first we will discuss the next slide, please. the two trials which we are going to, the scheme of the two trials. The first one being the SOLO-1 trial, which actually looked at newly diagnosed advanced ovarian cancer, any surgical outcome, regardless of whether it was complete cytoreduction or patients with residual disease. But the criteria required that all the patients should have a BRCA mutation. These patients got surgery and chemotherapy, which is a standard treatment, followed by olaparib maintenance. So the question which was asked was whether olaparib maintenance will improve outcomes in BRCA mutant patients. The next study will be the PAOLA-1 study, which actually looked at newly diagnosed advanced ovarian cancer, any surgical outcome. This had both tumor BRCA mutant as well as non-tumor BRCA mutant patients and HRD positive and HRD negative patients. And the difference was that this trial allowed patients to take bevacizumab, which was considered standard of care at that point of time. And one of the critiques of the initial study was that this did not look at the bevacizumab impact in such patients. Next slide, please. So we will go with the first one, the SOLO-1 trial. Very simple trial design. Newly diagnosed patients underwent cytoreductive surgery. And next slide, please. So the patients, on getting the complete response after the initial platinum-based chemotherapy or on a partial response, were randomized to either olaparib or placebo. It was a 2:1 randomization, continued till progression. Next slide, please. And the primary endpoint for this study was the investigator-assessed PFS. And secondary endpoint, as in all studies, were the PFS by the independent committee, then PFS2, overall survival, and the quality of life. Next slide. And the period of treatment was 2 years. So it was a well-balanced study. Primarily, it had all the patients with ECOG 0 and 1, which is difficult to find in our practice. And if you see the BRCA mutation was a compulsory entry ticket for this study. All the patients needed to have a BRCA mutation. Next slide, please. So upfront surgery was done in around 60%, almost matches with our real life practice, and interval cytoreduction in around 36%. This was also similar in both the arms. Next slide, please. And the residual microscopic disease. This is one thing which actually was said as a favorable thing in patients who receive bevacizumab. If they have residual microscopic disease, bevacizumab improves outcome. So almost a quarter of the patients in this study had residual microscopic disease after surgery. Next slide. Next slide, please. So the discontinuation, almost more than 50% of the patients in olaparib arm completed the protocol-defined treatment. And the discontinuation, if you take, was in 47% of the patients, of which 20% discontinued because of disease progression, which is expected because of the patients were taken out of study when there is disease progression. And this was 60% in the placebo arm, which means that by giving olaparib maintenance, about 1/3 of the patients didn't progress actually, as compared to the placebo, or 2/3. And adverse events was the reason in 11%, and the patient's decision was 8.5%. Next slide, please. So this is a overwhelming graph actually. We can drive a big car in between the graphs, which we don't see in many of the oncology graphs actually. So if you take the 2-year treatment cap and with the projection of 5 years progression-free survival of 48%, which is a remarkable improvement as compared to the placebo where it was 21%. And the PFS, median PFS in the olaparib arm was 56 versus 13.8. So just by taking the primary objective, the study is a positive study in BRCA mutant patients. Next slide, please. And similarly, the PFS2 or the time to starting the next systemic therapy and the overall survival all were significantly improved with the addition of olaparib. And so this says that by giving the olaparib maintenance, subsequent treatments are not altered. Next slide, please. So the side effects of olaparib, these are known to all of us. We have been using the PARP inhibitors in ovarian cancer for some time now, and we have used it in other indications as well. So mainly GI side effects and the fatigue, which are the most common side effects which we see with this, and anemia. Anemia is usually manageable. GI side effects and fatigue is the difficult to manage side effect. Next slide, please. So the takeaway from this study was that maintenance olaparib led to substantial improvement in PFS in newly diagnosed patients who have a BRCA mutation, and the difference in median PFS to the region of 3 years. So 2/3, that is 67% reduction in risk of progression. There was 20% progression in the olaparib arm versus 60% in the other arm. And the median PFS was 56 months in the olaparib versus 13.8 with placebo. A reduction in the risk of second progression or death was also observed, demonstrating that olaparib maintenance does not diminish the benefit of subsequent therapy, which is important in ovarian cancer, because regardless of what we do, we will have to deal with the second progression as well as multiple second line, third line treatments in ovarian cancer. So there was no decrease in health-related quality of life from baseline to the olaparib treated patients, but this is a subjective thing. For some patients, fatigue can be a difficult symptom to manage when we are on PARP inhibitors, especially in a maintenance phase. Next slide, please. So we go to the next study, which is more interesting study, the PAOLA-1 study. Next slide. Again, similar group of patients, but it is not selected by a compulsory BRCA mutation being present. Surgery could be upfront or interval, platinum or taxane-based chemotherapy, and more than or equal to 3 cycles of bevacizumab. So by this time, the bevacizumab has been approved in the treatment of advanced ovarian cancer, as Dr. Ravi Divakar said, in multiple phase 3 randomized trials. Patients who got the CR or no evidence of disease or a partial response were randomized to get bevacizumab for the prescribed period, and the other arm got olaparib and bevacizumab in a 2:1 randomization, 800 patients. Again, the primary endpoint was investigator assessed PFS. Then a secondary endpoints, similar secondary endpoints, safety and quality of life definitely will be crucial secondary endpoints when we are giving 2 medications as maintenance. And there was a pre-specified exploratory endpoint, which is expected because we have included all comers here, and whether there was a difference in the tumor BRCA mutant and the HRD positive patients. Next slide, please. So this is the interesting thing is that what are we looking at in non-BRCA mutant patient? That is what this trial was supposed to answer. And this allowed, there was a pre-specified biomarker assessment for a subgroup analysis, and there was active maintenance bevacizumab. So this is the only phase 3 study of a PARP inhibitor with an active standard of care comparator. Next slide, please. So the baseline characteristics, if you take, almost similar to the previous one. The BRCA mutation here was present only in 30%. This also is true with our usual practice. We see around 25%, and the largest study which was done in multiple centers, I think there was 25% positivity of BRCA mutation. And now we know that BRCA mutation, if you search more, you get more. So this is also something which we'll have to discuss maybe in the panel discussion. And upfront surgery was done in exactly 50% of these patients. There was residual microscopic disease in around 40% among them. And interval was done in around 42%. Residual microscopic disease in 30% of them. That also fits in the real life scenario. And response to treatment was no evidence of disease in around half, complete response in around 20, and partial response in around 26. Next slide, please. So around 537 patients were randomized to the olaparib plus the bevacizumab, and 269 to the bevacizumab alone. And discontinuation of treatment again happened 60% of the patients in the combination and 72% of the patients in the placebo plus bevacizumab arm. And mostly there was 1/3 of the patients in the study arm discontinued because of the progression of disease, whereas 60%, 58% actually in the other arm. So definitely there was some benefit of adding olaparib to bevacizumab when you take all comers here. And some other reasons, non-RECIST criteria, patient decision, death, other reasons are also there. And median duration of treatment in the olaparib placebo arm was 17.3 months versus 15.6 months in the bevacizumab alone arm. Next slide, please. So this was the primary endpoint, that was PFS by independent review, and there was an improvement there. The hazard ratio was 0.59. So this is regardless of any criteria, BRCA or HRD. So this trial met its primary endpoint. I would say that still it is a significant improvement, though not as significant or as widely appreciable like the SOLO-1 trial, but still significant improvement as compared to bevacizumab alone. And median time from first cycle of chemotherapy to randomization was 7 months. Next slide, please. And as expected, when you have the pre-specified PFS subgroup analysis, there was not much of difference between the groups, like elderly people, stage 3 versus stage 4, ECOG performance status, no residual disease versus residual macroscopic disease, or upfront surgery versus interval surgery. And patients who got a CR or a no evidence of disease actually fared better than those who had a PR. Next slide, please. And the BRCA mutant patients were 29%. HRD positive patients were 48%, which is significantly high. And that brings the importance of actually getting a proper HRD testing done in all our patients who can benefit by the addition of PARP inhibitors. Next slide, please. So if you take intent to treat all comers, there was an improvement in PFS of 7.8 months. If you take the BRCA mutant patients, the tumor BRCA mutant patients, there is it's no brainer actually to choose, because the difference is in median PFS is 15.5 months. So this is proven beyond doubt that if you have a tumor BRCA mutant patient and you are able to give any kind of PARP inhibitor, definitely there is going to be an improvement in outcome. And HRD positive patients, which is around 48% in this study, there was an improvement by 19.5 months. So it is like from 16 months to around 36 months, which is a remarkable improvement. And if that contributes to 48% of the patient population, definitely something to look at. The other side of it is that if you have HRD negative or unknown, there is not much of a difference by using a PARP inhibitor. So that is the main thing to take from the study. So this defines that if you add a PARP inhibitor to bevacizumab, definitely there is some improvement. And if more so, if the patient has got a tumor BRCA mutation or an HRD positivity. Next slide, please. So non-BRCA mutant patients, this is like our usual survival curves in advanced ovarian cancer, which we have been used to seeing. Not much of a difference here. 27% of the patients in the placebo arm, 9% in the olaparib arm received a PARP inhibitor as their first subsequent treatment, which might have affected this curve. Next slide, please. So just like the PFS, the response rates were also matching. If you take overall population, 30 versus 25, BRCA mutant population, 64 versus 42, HRD positive, 53 versus 31. So definitely improvement in patients who have BRCA mutant and HRD positivity. Next slide, please. And when you talk about the non-BRCA mutant patient, what were the adverse events? When you are giving 2 drugs instead of 1 drug, and even giving 1 drug as maintenance is difficult. So median duration of treatment, we already said it was 17.3 versus 15.6. And median duration with bevacizumab was 11 versus 10.6. And all grade adverse events were similar in both the arms actually. And grade 3 or more toxicity was 57 versus 51. Serious adverse events also similar. So as per this, this study proved that adding olaparib to bevacizumab as maintenance is not that difficult. Next slide, please. And the usual side effects which is expected of, again, the GI side effects, anemia, lymphopenia, and the fatigue was the most common side effects which were seen. There was no specific notable side effects because there was an addition of bevacizumab in this study. So pretty well tolerated treatment. Next slide, please. And one of the concerns which was there when the initial data on PARP inhibitors came was the reports on MDS, AML, and aplastic anemia. I think now we have data from almost all the PARP inhibitor class of drugs that this is not much of a concern actually, with long-term follow-up available for most of them. Next slide, please. And quality of life, health-related quality of life, there's no significant difference. We saw the adverse event profile as well. Next slide, please. So the takeaway from this study was that the only study which looked at adding a PARP inhibitor to the active treatment, which included bevacizumab, and it's a representative population. It unselected by the biomarker status, which is what we also want to look at. And HRD positive patients who constitute 48% of this study, there was a remarkable improvement in PFS. Similarly, a improvement was seen in tumor BRCA positive patients as well. And the PFS2 also demonstrated that the benefit continued and tolerability was well characterized and consistent with the previous knowledge. There was no detriment in the health-related quality of life. I think that's all I have from these two studies. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for excellent presentation. I think any questions that I can put in the chat box, we can discuss in the panel discussion. Anything is there, I can. Thank you, Prasad sir, for an excellent session. And I request Dr. Rahul Sood, Senior Medical Oncologist from Commando Hospital, Bangalore. I request him to speak about the diagnostic tool available in first-line ovarian cancer patients. Like I request Dr. Rahul Sood to take over the session.
Thank you, Dr. Satish, for the kind introduction, and thanks for the invitation, and thank you once again for the organizers. My topic is probably the talk of the town, that is the diagnostic tool which is now available for ovarian cancer patients. And like it was covered very effectively, that we were nowhere in ovarian cancer. We had not made any progress for the last 20 years. So probably what we do remember is we lose every year literally 2 lakh individual ladies to the ovarian cancer. More than that, the morbidity and the frequent change of therapy and frequent lines of chemotherapy is another cause of concern, not just for the patient, but for the quality of life that the patient also have. We now know that 85% of the ovarian cancers are sporadic and only 15% of ovarian cancers are familial. BRCA1 and BRCA2 are the most commonly mutated genes, and now we have learned about them and we know what to do about it. Next slide, please. So the ultrasound was the first diagnostic method which probably picked out a adnexal mass, which was confirmed by the CT and the MRI, which probably showed the adnexal mass more clearly along with the peritoneal involvement. The CA-125 was for a long time the only marker we had, and we knew that only in the epithelial cancers it was elevated, and that too, it did not give us a clear picture in the early stage. Also, more or less because of the CA-125, probably we were able to diagnose ovarian cancers once they were very much advanced, probably stage 3 or beyond. So now genetic testing with the BRCA mutation, I won't call it as a diagnostic investigation, but probably the investigation which guides us to plan our therapy is probably the in thing for ovarian cancer. Next slide, please. So if we see the BRCA mutation and the risk of cancer, starting with breast cancer, where probably the BRCA1 and BRCA2 accounts for 80 to 70% of individuals. And this is almost half seen in the ovarian cancer, 40 to 18%. We have also seen that the BRCA mutations are seen in prostate cancer and the sinister pancreatic cancer, where it provides another ray of hope for such patients. In the US population itself, individuals at the age of 70 years and beyond, the BRCA1 carriers as well as BRCA2 carriers are significantly high. Similar trends are seen in the ovarian cancer. Next slide, please. So when the patient used to ask us before, doctor, why are you asking for a BRCA mutation? We were left with words. What do we tell them? They used to ask us, is it a good thing to have a BRCA mutation or is it a bad thing? And again, we were probably tight-lipped. But now I think we know that the BRCA is used for the treatment decision, and we tell our patients the same. That is, we can plan our chemotherapy and plan our maintenance thereafter. It tells us about the prognostic factors. We tell them that the BRCA mutant cancers are aggressive, they metastasize, they recur, so we need to be aggressive with them. And definitely the risk assessment for the family members is of utmost importance, because the process of genetic anticipation, where the disease may occur early in the family and the subsequent generation, is what is a part of the genetic counseling that we instilled into the patient. Next slide, please. So I'll not go into this slide because it was beautifully covered by Dr. Prasad just before. And so these are the two trials, the SOLO one and the PAULA one, and we've heard about it. So I'll go to the next slide, which basically have established olaparib or the PARP inhibitors in the BRCA mutant cases. Very surprisingly, even today, 33% of the patient know about the BRCA status prior to the first line of chemotherapy. But these figures are gradually increasing. The study was done where the primary debulking surgery versus the interval debulking surgery was there. And amongst the two groups, it was found that only 33% knew about the BRCA status. Next slide, please. So what is the referral criteria? For a long time, we were thinking of a family history. You used to make a tedious family tree of the individual. Very difficult to get a history down south, especially if you don't know the language. The age, yes, the young age, we were definitely asking for a BRCA. And as soon as we saw the histological serotype of the serous high grade, we were asking. But now this has changed. Invariably, we are asking for a BRCA in each and every case of ovarian cancer. And the reason for this is quite simple. Next slide, please. 15 to 44% of individuals with no family history of ovarian or breast cancer will have a BRCA mutation. And this is a significant figure. Next slide, please. Also, we should not forget that 47% of individuals do not have a significant family history of ovarian cancer. And it is not just the young, but 71%, that is 71% of a population more than 50 years or older will harbor a BRCA mutation. So therefore, the criteria of age, histology, and probably also of the individual does not hold good in today's world. Next slide, please. Once again, high-grade serous, definitely, but we know that the other histologies, the mucinous, the clear, the endometrioid, also harbor mutation. So therefore, the time has come, probably the BRCA has to be ordered in all such all subtypes. Next slide. Next slide. So this is what they are doing. Could we go to the previous slide, please? Yeah. So this is what they are doing in Europe, and I totally agree with this. It is important to make a roadmap of all the individuals once you start the treatment. That is, it is important to know how you are going to plan. Similar like lung, I think ovary is next. You need to plan and sequence out your treatment. So therefore, in all the countries in Europe, at diagnosis, the BRCA testing is done. And this is done after, not just to eliminate the loss of follow-up, but also to inform the prognosis as well as make the clinical decisions. Next slide, please. And so just a word about the germline BRCA mutation. Why the germline BRCA mutation is a mutation which is inherited from the parents. Therefore, it is picked up in the blood. Whereas any mutation which occurs afterwards, that is the DNA damage occurs after birth, is called as a somatic mutation. And the subsequent development of inactivating mutation remains as a wild type in the gene leading to a loss of function. So this is in a nutshell regarding the germline and the somatic. The germline is what we get from our parents. The somatic is what we get through our lifetime. And why is it important? Next slide, please. It is important because look at the number of studies that have been done for the germline mutations in ovarian cancer. And India is no less, 22% of germline BRCA mutation is seen in India, as high as anywhere else all over in all the world. Next slide, please. And regarding the somatic, even for the somatic mutation, if you see, anywhere between 6 to 10% is the frequency of the somatic mutation. And mind you, many of these individuals have already had a germline mutation. So therefore, probably the somatic mutations were not tested in many of these individuals. Next slide, please. So how do we do it? The blood testing identifies the germline mutation. That is the first thing. It's easy, probably cheaper, and also the first test. If it is negative, you go for a somatic mutation, which is done on the tissue, and then you have the entire profile. With the AstraZeneca providing us the good coupons, we are able to do both. So invariably, we go ahead and do these mutation analysis in all our patients. Next slide, please. And why is it helpful? If you see this nice pizza pie chart, like I call it, if you see the small slice in the first pizza, that is the BRCA1 and 2 mutation is detected, germline BRCA in 43%. And subsequently, if you take the rest, you may also find a somatic mutation later on. Therefore, to find the entire BRCA population, the two tests have to be done. You get it in the germline, well and good. If you don't stop there, you do the somatic testing. And this is how the study 19 was planned. You get the BRCA and how it was put in the olaparib placebo arm. I think it was covered. Next slide, please. So a lot of controversies, but they all speak the same, the ESMO, the NCC, and the ASCO and SGO. And if you take out all the brownie points from that, what they basically say is go ahead and do a BRCA mutation in all cases of ovarian, fallopian, and primary peritoneal cancers. Yes, definitely in the cases of epithelial and high-grade serous, in whether the family history is present or not. So probably that is what each and every guideline says in different words. Next slide, please. So a very nice cartoon of how to go ahead with the olaparib maintenance. So what actually happened, there may be two scenarios, and these are the two scenarios we see in our clinical practice. You diagnose an ovarian cancer, give them a neoadjuvant chemotherapy, either on biopsy and then you do the surgery. So you have two tissues, give them platinum-based chemotherapy, do a genetic counseling, do a histological analysis, you find a germline or a somatic mutation and give them olaparib maintenance. Or if you find that the platinum-free interval is longer and there is a tumor relapse, re-challenge them with the same therapy and give them maintenance thereafter. So these are the two scenarios we get. The gap between the maintenance and the platinum therapy is kept as maximum of 8 weeks. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, we should go ahead with a prompt, comprehensive investigation. BRCA testing at diagnosis ideally should be done in all patients. Only tumor BRCA testing enables the detection of both germline and somatic mutation. We know it by now. Many of the times we start teaching the same to our pathologists. Mind you, many of them don't know. And PARP inhibitors have shown a promising role, and it was covered very beautifully, that there is a disease-free survival, and why not if you can delay chemotherapy in such individual. So PARP inhibitors have shown a promising role in the management of ovarian cancers. Thank you very much to the organizers, Dr. Satish, AstraZeneca. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahul, for an excellent presentation covering the diagnostic tool in ovarian cancer. I think I request Dr. Rahul to be in a panel. You can have a question and this one, anything we can have a question. But I request Dr. Amit Rohit. He is a senior medical oncologist from Manipal Cancer Hospital, Bangalore, and to conduct a panel discussion. I request sir to take over sessions.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Satish, and thank you, AstraZeneca, for giving me this opportunity. So we have had some excellent talks, and we have had a good detailed discussion of management of CA ovary, and we have learned how to manage it. Now let's look at what we do in the clinic and how we take it further there. So let's get through. So we've seen this. Now we know the management of ovarian cancer. We will start with, if it's operable, we'll go ahead and do an optimal debulking, and we may give IV, IP, dose dense, plus minus bevacizumab. or if it's not operable, we'll give neoadjuvant chemo, and then we will operate after getting it down, and then give further chemo plus minus bevacizumab. And then now almost every patient will go to maintenance. So today's discussion is all going to be on maintenance and how we will choose maintenance for our patients. So let's start with some case scenarios. I would like to invite my panelists because I forgot that completely. So Sir, Dr. Shekhar Patil sir, Dr. Poonam Patil, Dr. Krishna Prasad, Dr. Murli Subramaniam, Dr. Sangeeta, Dr. Vinayak Maka, Dr. Rajiv.
Dr. Rahul will be there. I think Dr. Murli Subramanian is not there, I think.
Right. Okay. Right. Great.
Sir, now, even Dr. Krishna Prasad is not there. So can I request Prasad Narayan sir and Ravi sir to also join the panel? Excellent.
I think we can have all the speakers also, because they will have very valuable inputs because they know all the trials in much more detail. So let's take it further. Patient case A, 66-year-old female who came with abdominal pain, CA-125 is raised, good performance status, no relevant personal history. Workup showed a stage 3 ovarian cancer, and it is looking like an operable disease. So let's start off. So how do you start off, and when do you do the testing? Dr. Vinayak, I'll start with you. When do you start testing your patients for BRCA mutations, and what all tests do you do?
So BRCA testing I do for all patients of ovarian cancer now. The cost is reasonable now. So coming to the question, when I'll do it, as early as possible if you have tumor tissue. In this case, we not have the tissue at place, so not for this patient. If you have the tissue in hand, I would go with the both somatic as well as germline testing.
So if your patient has not yet operated and has come to you, would you send the BRCA that time, or you're going to wait for surgery and let them come to you, and then you're going to send both blood and tumor together?
So the thing is, what prognostic was 2, 3. Rahul said 3 ways we do it. If you're doing for therapeutic PARP inhibitor, I would like to do it on tumor also. So it will be after the surgery with the tissue available, and I'll do it both germline as well as somatic.
Right. Okay. Rajiv, do you test at this time frame, or do you prefer to test after the surgery when they come to you when you're starting the chemo? Okay, I don't think I have Rajiv here. Yeah, okay. Dr. Sangeeta, can I ask?
Yes, yeah, sure. I think if we, whenever I would prefer to get it upfront so that, you can have a decision to make. So I would prefer to go it upfront.
Right. Okay. Dr. Poonam, I wanted to know, do you test only your high-grade epithelial ovarian cancers for germline BRCA, or are you now testing all the patients which you see for ovarian cancer?
Would like to test all the patients, but preferably high-grade serous carcinomas where the incidence of BRCA mutation is high.
Right.
So the other things, probably maybe germline first, and if it is negative, then somatic if it's feasible to do it sequentially.
Right. I think sort of all of us are in the same situation. We all want definitely to test as early as possible. We'd probably send a germline BRCA, and yes, if we have tissue after that, we'd definitely do a somatic BRCA also. We would prefer testing the epithelial ovarian cancers much more, the high-grade epithelial ones, and we do test the remaining also because we know that small portion, Dr. Sood showed us that there's a small percentage of other patients also having it, but the high-grade serous, absolutely we need to test all of them. So this patient is tested, confirmed germline BRCA mutation, and she undergoes surgery and then gets the 6 cycles of chemotherapy. So now for maintenance, how would you proceed next in terms of maintenance? I think, let me ask Vinayak.
I think ideal situation, a PARP inhibitor. So we are far from the ideal situation. So we observe till observe them for recurrence. Because if we can't do the PARP inhibitor, that's what I'm trying to tell you.
Right. So PARP inhibitors for everyone who can afford it. Dr. Shekhar Patil, sir, are you offering everyone a PARP inhibitor in this situation now, in this current situation?
Yeah, definitely. Yes. With such a strong data available now, I think each and every patient definitely with any BRCA mutations should be offered for a maintenance treatment for 2 years if they can afford. That is the query. If they cannot afford, then whatever is the possible thing, we follow it up. I think with such a good data available, I think there is nothing else which can give such a very good benefit in this group of people.
Right, sir.
Dr. Amit, can I ask you?
Yes.
You don't offer for someone who is affording and able to take. Is there any population you don't want to offer PARP inhibitor? Because you're asking the question, I think you have answer.
No, I was coming to the next part of it because I was leading to the other thing is the next steps of it, because my question was coming to duration of therapy. So I think what I'll do is so we've seen this curves, and Murli Prasad showed this to us. Prasad, I wanted to put this to you. Prasad, you're there, right?
Yeah, I'm there, Amit.
Yeah. So Prasad, just wanted to put it to you. You're absolutely happy with the PFS data, right? There's no question in this situation you would say, I want to see OS data. You're okay with that, right?
Because there are some PFS data which just speaks for themselves. Yeah, we might not. There is no need to wait for OS data for this actually.
Right. So
if there is a BRCA like this patient which you presented,
right,
there is nothing which can stop giving a PARP inhibitor to that patient actually.
Right. So absolutely, all of us are very convinced about olaparib's the PARP inhibitor benefit in the first line setting. So a little bit question about duration, So we've seen some exciting data from the other trials also. You saw the PRIMA trial and you saw niraparib, there's a duration of 3 years and olaparib duration of 2 years. I'm happy with the 2-year data, but what do you think about this? There's a little difference between the duration of PARPs you're using in the adjuvant setting. Prasad?
So I think it's just based on the design of the study, right? So I don't think there was any rationale behind choosing. It's less like the trastuzumab duration of 1 year. I don't think it's based on any data to say that 3 years is better, because I think the calculation will be based on the large percent of the patients who relapse within the first 3 years or 2 years, and then try to get the maximum outcome by giving it for that much duration.
Right. So we're quite. Yes.
So just want to these all 3 trials, I think probably we can never be able to compare these trials to decide the duration, isn't it? And probably some of it is it like, okay, if they have had a partial response at initial, they have continued more than 2 years and ongoing. And if they have got a good response, they have just kept it at 2 years. The lot of variation between the duration. Is it really comparable between each? We can't compare these cross trials.
Yeah, we are not. You're absolutely correct, Dr. Sangeeta. We should not be comparing cross trials, but it's going to come up soon when we start having usage of drugs. There's going to be a big question. So we've just got it, and we've started using it, and we are all very comfortable now. But we have not reached the 2-year mark. So in 2 years, you're going to start having your patients who are going to ask you, do you want to stop at 2 years? It's going to happen. I'm telling you, as slowly we get into that question of benefit. So we keep worrying, will the curves come downwards once you have stopped? Though at 3 years, we have seen it, they have not come down at all in SOLO 1. So we are very excited about it. But the question will keep coming, will the curves drop? And at 2 years, we'll start, if our patient asks us, do you think the benefit will persist? I'm germline BRCA. We'll have to start thinking to answer, no, the trial stops at 2, but there are other trials which talk about 3. So very interesting questions will pop up as time goes by.
Sure.
Right. So I think first line situation, germline BRCA, all of us are very, very convinced. Absolutely no doubt in our minds. We do.
Can I ask a question?
Yes,
this is regarding the HRD testing.
Yeah, that's the next case.
Next one. Okay, fine.
Next case. So this is case 2, and again we'll do the same thing. We'll just say this is our patient who has stage 3C disease, and we did a germline BRCA and it comes out negative. Let me start, Dr. Shekhar Patil. What do you do in this situation, sir, when you have a germline BRCA is negative in these patients?
Generally, I start off with the chemotherapy plus bevacizumab if there is any suboptimal debulking happened. If there is any suspicion of residual disease, I'll add the bevacizumab. And if possible, I'll send the tumor tissue for the HRD analysis. So that is what next I'm going to do it with a view that we may be missing about 5 to 6% of these patients which are HRD positive. We may be missed on the germline mutation. So that is what I am going to recommend if a patient is able to afford. Only the problem with this HRD and all these things is we have to do with the next generation sequencing, ordering for the test. The test cost is going to be very, very heavy. And that is what is going to be the limitation. That's what I want to ask you only whether which test you ask and how you, that is what you can answer. Sir.
Yeah, that's what, sir. I wanted to discuss this about all of us. What do we do for HRD? Because this is something we'll have to standardize very soon in clinical practice. Dr. Poonam, let me just take your inputs. What do you do after this? HRD testing, what are your thoughts on this?
Absolutely, it should be done. So that is no doubt about it, that it should be done or not. The practical scenario is that very few actually end up doing it, because the extended panel is more expensive compared to BRCA1 and 2, which the cost of BRCA1 and 2 sometimes is just, I think, 12,000 or 10,000 is the minimum. For MedGenome with AstraZeneca coupons, it comes to around 9,000 rupees. So that is very cheap. Whereas if we do the extended panel, which includes HRD and everything, it is financially more burden to the patient.
Right. So Dr. Poonam brought out an important part of that question of costing of testing. I can tell you what my dilemma is in clinical practice. If I need a HRD test, it has to go through either, if you go through the trials, either if you're seeing Prima or you're seeing Paolo, both of them are going through HRD testing through either the Myriad testing or the Foundation test, where they have prepared a score. And they've changed the score twice, but both of them have their own scoring saying, okay, more than 42, that's HRD positive. Now, our Indian labs have started doing HRD testing, but the problem is we don't know what the exact score is. And we don't have that reference. And because it is kind of patented, even the labs, we spoke to them in detail, like MedGenome has started doing HRD, but MedGenome itself says we don't know what the exact score is. So they are probably preparing their own part of it. So we can probably say, yes, we have a PALB2, we have a RAD51. You can get that information, but you don't know what the exact score is. So this is a dilemma in clinical practice. So if I have a affording patient, as Dr. Shekhar Patil said, sir, if I have a affording patient, I just do a Foundation 1 or a Myriad testing and send the tumor block to them, and I get a HRD score, which we have done in patients and seen it. But the problem is, if my patient can't afford this, how should I rely on our labs which don't know the HRD score? So I would still say, if I have a PALB2 or a RAD1, I'm going to give the benefit of doubt to the patient. But we will not be doing exactly what is in the clinical trial. Prasad, what are your takes on this?
Yeah, so my take is that if the germline, like this patient, so if I'm going to test further, I will definitely go for Foundation 1 or Myriad test. Mostly Foundation 1 is what I have sent for a couple, not many patients, but if you are looking at treatment with olaparib, if I think that this patient can afford that for this much time, that patient should be able to do this test. That is what my take is here. Actually.
Correct. A good point. That's a good point. If patient can afford olaparib, definitely one test can be done. Definitely. Dr. Rahul, you discussed about testing, so I would take your inputs on this, on the point of the HRD testing also. Okay. Okay, Rahul's not around. Okay. So this is a dilemma, and I think as of now we are using Foundation 1, we are using Myriad's testing, but selectively. But this is something that, as Dr. Poonam mentioned, we should do the extended testing and we should look for it. We have seen the clear benefit, and HRD testing is clearly approved for these group of patients. So the next point of, so this is our patient. Eventually, she underwent neoadjuvant chemo and got an HRD positive score. And then you go in through the chemo, and what next? Dr. Sangeeta.
Hi, sir. So this is like more, this is the right picture where you want to use PARP inhibitors. So these pictures are like, where you want to use maintenance trial. If a patient can afford, definitely yes.
So what PARP inhibitors? Next is that question always.
Yes, that is it. So I think olaparib would be fine enough.
So you would extrapolate. It is BRCA negative. We don't have that data for the olaparib single agent. It's HRD positive.
Then you have to go with niraparib.
Okay.
Where all comers were used. So it's basically that you want to use what type of PARP inhibitor. So I think if we have to extrapolate data, then niraparib would be fine, where all patients, all comers were included in the trial.
Right. And what about your inputs on the PAOLO? Would you want to?
So PAOLO is something that I really could not understand. I mean, probably even I have a question. PAOLO wasn't the patients where, probably patients who would have even benefited with bevacizumab, who had, they excluded patients with R0 and stage 3, all that. So something that I really want to ask, how to extrapolate data of PAOLO into real clinical experience. Who would you really recommend Ola with bevacizumab?
So, Prasad, you will take that?
Yeah, I think I would say that PAOLO 1 is a much more important study to get a perspective of the benefit of PARP inhibitors, especially in BRCA mutant and HRD positive patients, because the criticism, or if you want to debate against the role of maintenance PARP inhibitors, it was always that we can always debate about the role of bevacizumab here, because I also had done a debate in favor of bevacizumab, and my point was that if you give bevacizumab upfront with chemo, you convert around another 20% of the patients to receive maintenance, who would not have gone into maintenance if you are not given bevacizumab. But this study actually was a daring study, I would say, and it took all comers. And if you just take the primary objective, there is still a difference in PFS. So I think it's a good study, and I would say it's a practice-changing study. If there is no question of finances to be discussed, if a patient can afford, there is nothing wrong in actually prescribing both maintenance. And if a patient has got, now this patient, if it is HRD positive here, there is a huge improvement by combining both. Shekhar Patil sir said he would have given this patient bevacizumab because of the multiple peritoneal metastasis, and if there was a suboptimal debulking. So these patients would benefit definitely by a combination. So I think that's a very well designed study, and that was the need of our kind of a study.
So my only criticism, or not criticism, I would say my only hesitation with this data is they should have put an arm of only olaparib.
Yes.
So that would have clearly answered in our minds that olaparib is there, and olaparib bev is superior to olaparib also for the HRD positive. So that was one thing which missed out, and that kind of always makes a little bit of in your mind. It comes to, is the benefit coming for which is benefiting, or maybe olaparib alone would be good for these patients. But that's only unfortunate, but they could not do it because olaparib alone was not the standard of care that time. So they couldn't
right.
that as
so I think that was difficult. I mean, they couldn't have designed that study that way.
Correct. At that time, they couldn't design it. That's true. I agree fully. Now they could do it because the primer data is clearly there. So they could do that. Sir, Dr. Shekhar Patil, sir, have you started any of these patients on a PARP plus BEV in this first line treatment? Do you think you will do it, or you would still prefer single agent?
My take from all this thing is definitely I'll go for a maintenance treatment. If I have got a patient who has got a BRCA mutant type, whether it is tumor or a germline, I'll go for a single agent olaparib as a maintenance for 2 years. If I have got which is a BRCA wild type, which is HRD positive from Myriad or the foundation one,
Right.
I will consider for bevacizumab with olaparib for 2 years, bevacizumab for 1 year. If I got a patient who is BRCA wild type and HRD also is negative, I will go only with bevacizumab. I use some type of maintenance in all my practice. This is how I have framed in mind. But as of now, we are using only olaparib because
Right.
I am not doing this HRD too often. So this is the frame from all the studies I am thinking in that terms.
Right, right. So I think all of us are agreeing with you, sir. This is probably the best way you're thinking about. So tumor. My only again the hesitation will be if you had tumor BRCA wild type and HRD positive, and suppose next year niraparib becomes available to you. So would you use niraparib because you have a single agent niraparib data, or would you use Paolo and use olaparib plus bevacizumab? Dr. Ravi Divakar, if you are there, shall I put this question to you?
Pardon? Hello?
Hello. Yeah, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, a question to you. If you have tumor BRCA wild type but HRD is positive,
yeah,
and you have two options of the Paolo data saying olaparib plus bevacizumab, and next year niraparib becomes available to you, which way would you favor?
I think
how would you choose, sir?
If I could use a single drug, I would use niraparib probably.
Okay, so you would choose because of the convenience of a single drug.
Yeah, and it's an oral drug. You don't have to give IV. Cost again, you can probably reduce. Even though we have now a lot of generic bevacizumab is available, but still for a year it could cost some amount. I think if you have that data, I think niraparib I would go ahead with.
You'd prefer niraparib single in that setting, right? Vinayak, would you go the same way, or do you think bevacizumab has an added advantage and you would probably do that?
I think I will say with sir that if I have to give a maintenance therapy for 2 years, I would prefer a single drug.
Right.
This is a disease of not going to end very soon. So
yeah,
it'll be very interesting to see what they did after post PARP inhibitors, maintenance.
Right. So I think both of these are approved in this setting. There's clearly niraparib approved, and there's also the Paolo data approved. And for us,
Yes, just one thing. Like in the Paolo, like with the tumor BRCA mutation negative, isn't the PFS was relatively not really great. I just wanted to confirm.
So you're talking of
the Paolo.
Yes.
Was it really the survival in negative, BRCA negative HRD was really great?
So it was 0.6. So this is the middle one you're showing is the Paolo HRD positive, excluding the BRCA. It's 0.6 hazards, which are pretty good. So clearly it was significant. And the same way, it's 0.56 for HRD positive, including the BRCA. So it's the HRD negative is the issue where there was no difference. So the difference is almost the same because you're added Bev. So Bev is adding on to some more advantage there. So you'll probably see a little bit of difference in numbers there because Bev is also there. So that's where it comes to, you keep thinking in some ways, like Prasad said, Paolo takes away that decision making for you. You can give Bev if you thought Bev was a good drug, and you can add the olaparib. And with a combination, you'd probably do better is what you would think about. What about you, Dr. Poonam? How would you think about it?
No, I would probably, what Dr. Shekhar Patil said, that how would I divide? I think that is how I would do. I have no experience with niraparib, some experience with olaparib. So if I have to choose between the two, olaparib is probably good enough.
Right. I will ask a controversial question. So if anyone, if HRD positive, no BRCA, would you be happy doing olaparib without the Bev? I'll put it to Prasad.
I think it's fine. I'm okay with that. As Dr. Poonam, and Dr. Shekhar Patil sir said, I think our experience has been with olaparib because the drug is available and it's fine. I don't think that there will be a difference in terms of just because there is no data. That is because it was not asked as a question in that study. That's all.
Correct. I kind of think I would agree with you, but that's the way it's not been approved, and it has to be with Bev because that's the way the trial was done. So unfortunately, that arm missed out, and so we don't have that answer with us. Right. So the last group is the HRD negative, BRCA negative. Dr. Vinayak.
Yes, sir.
HRD negative, BRCA negative, do you kind of believe in doing any form of maintenance?
Some kind of maintenance is required because eventually patients do relapse in a shorter time without maintenance. So as a sir said, the spectrum, at least some kind of maintenance therapy, either BEV or sometimes we try to use Pazapinib or something, but it's not my choice, but sometimes some kind of maintenance is required.
So BEV is BEV is perfectly a fair option. I would ask Dr. Shekhar Patil, sir. Sir, the PRIMA data showed that, and it is approved for both HRD negative, BRCA negative. Yes. And though the benefit is so small, but FDA has approved it. And we have already heard of patients in the US who are taking the drug for this indication. We've actually had a couple of patients who were in touch with us and who have been started on it, though they were fully negative, and they said it's approved by PRIMA, so we're going to do it. What do you think, sir, about this?
As such, I feel not very comfortable, basically because the BRCA testing and the HRD testing are the spectrum, because in the whole, if somebody is BRCA positive, the intensity is much better. The PARP inhibitors efficacy will be better. If both are negative, the PARP inhibitors work will be, or one is negative, that HRD is negative, BRCA is mutated, or HRD is. So in that group of people, the intensity of PARP inhibitor, the benefits of PARP inhibitor may become less. That's only I'm not very comfortable using PARP inhibitor as a alone treatment. I'll be comfortable if something like BEV is added to the treatment. That's only single agent in this group. I am not very comfortable still as such.
Right, sir. I think all of us are sort of in that same boat, because we kind of, though FDA approved it and though the trial was positive, the PRIMA data was hazards of 0.68. So the FDA has approved it and patients are receiving Niraparib. It kind of is, we are not really convinced about the value of benefit. The benefit was only for about probably 2-3 months benefit. For that, you're going to give 3 years of Niraparib, and you never know whether really you're doing value for treatment. So even kind of, we are not very acceptable for our patients who are HRD negative, BRCA negative. But when we spoke to some experts, the reason they said is, they kept saying that when we do HRD testing, we may be sometimes missing some patients. And so in this, if you just put them on PARP, you're not missing those patients. So there's really no harm in putting that on. You don't lose out on those patients, but kind of that's something we would not do in practice. We'd probably just look for HRD and BRCA and then only take the patients up.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Is there any data to say that you do HRD on the tumor tissue at progression or post initial therapy, they were BRCA HRD negative become HRD positive?
Interesting question, sir. No, we don't have that data, and it's
because if we know that data, maybe then you don't give olaparib or niraparib in the front line when both are negative and save it for a later date. Maybe.
Right. No, sir. I don't think we have data, and actually we believe it will not happen, that the HRD status will change because
I'm also not sure. I have no idea.
So there's very unlikely to be an acquired mutation in one of these genes in the down the line. It's probably more that. So sometimes when we say somatic BRCA and germline BRCA, we do say you may acquire a BRCA in certain number of 6% of patients. So you may have a point there, but at least in data sets, we don't have that data saying that we are acquiring new mutations and becoming HRD status is changing.
Okay. Thank you.
So last was stage 4 patient, and stage 4 patients, Dr. Poonam, do you start off in these patients who are, suppose you have a pleural effusion cytology positive, are you starting off with BEV for your patients with chemo directly in this group of patients, or you're withholding the BEV?
No, if it is in the, say, pleural effusion, I don't mind starting BEV, and BEV definitely gives an added benefit over chemotherapy alone. But if there are extensive deposits, serosal deposits, and tumor nodules on the intestines, I would be a little wary here to avoid the risk of perforation.
Right.
So if it's with a palliative intent, yeah, I would definitely add on bevacizumab with any effusion or ascites.
Right. So that's the way we choose, and that's perfectly the best way forward. The only reason I was bringing up the question was if we have added Bev, then we can go the Paolo way quite easily. But if we finish 6 cycles of chemo and didn't add Bev, and then we found out that the BRCA is negative and HRD is positive, how would we extrapolate the Paolo data for our patients? And that's what I was thinking about. But as you said, this is what we do in practice. If we have pleural effusion, we are very comfortable. Ascites, we are very comfortable. But just nodules, we are always a little wary about having perforations. So I think this is where we have come to. At 2020, this is going to be a paradigm of treatment. There's absolutely no doubt. All our patients will receive maintenance in some form or the other. All our panelists spoke about accepting maintenance as treatment. It could be a PARP inhibitor alone, it could be Bev alone, and it could be Bev plus PARP. And we've seen some data which of PARP plus chemo, but that's not yet approved. So that's probably not something we take up, but you never know in future what would happen. Dr. Sangeeta, you warned us about this, that we shouldn't be comparing clinical trials, but we do it always in all our meetings, and we do it in all our talks, and we use it for clinical judgments.
Yes, and theory is different. Definitely, the clinical judgment is, you really look into each data to take a judgment. So that's not
correct. So this was my last slide, where we have put in all the 4 trials of the first line setting, and we've seen the benefit clearly. First line, all of us are absolutely convinced. Post surgery, we would give our patients olaparib, and 2 years of olaparib is what we would follow. Germline BRCA negative, but HRD positive. All of us are going to test for HRD, and we would prefer to do one of the foundation ones or the myriads, which give us the score. But I'm hoping that our Indian labs will also come up with once we have some validation of scores. I don't know how, but if we have a validation of a score, it would be nice to have a quick fix solution, which is a little bit more cheaper for our patients. But if they are HRD positive, then we would offer a Paolo-like regime of Bev plus olaparib. If both are negative, we are not very, very convinced of giving them PARP inhibitors, though the PRIMA data has shown niraparib is approved. And so that's something that we'd probably avoid. Dr. Sangeeta, I will ask you the last questions. What about toxicity in clinical practice? Have you had too much of experience, or any things you would want to comment on that?
Not really of much experience, and maybe only one patient I had, so who has been started recently. So it's just 1 month. So I don't have much experience with monitoring the toxicity as of now.
Right. Okay. Dr. Shekhar Patil, will you can give us all the inputs about the toxicity and the management, because that's a very important part of using olaparib, especially when we start talking of using it for 2 years duration.
Yeah, I think it is a very important thing, because it is not an easy drug to be used as we really think. It is like most of the patients complains of tiredness. That is the one common thing we see. Sometimes we see complaining of nausea, and also when we do the blood counts, the hemoglobin dropping. These are the 3 major side effects which we encounter. And good thing is that we see them in the first 3-4 months. If you monitor them closely, that is very important, because after that the toxicities become less and less. So the monitoring initially is important, and this may require a dose interruption or a dose reduction also may be required to make sure that the patient doesn't discontinue the treatment. In our few patients which used, one of the patient after 2 months he told, never I will take it. So there are some people, they get so tired and exhausted, no? Despite of so much of counseling, the patient discontinued. They took the chemotherapy, actually, the carboplatin, and we started the thing. So it is very important that we monitor the side effects. These are the major side effects. Other side effects are rare things. And if you closely monitor them in the first initial 3-4 months, that is very important, so that we can overcome most of the things.
Right. So, as Sir has mentioned, we have to be very careful in monitoring toxicities. So, one thing I would like to say is, even in our patients, we have seen a lot of anemia, and anemia has been really bothersome sometimes. that it just falls off and it keeps being in the range of that 7 to 8, and it gets troublesome, and you end up offering transfusion, which you don't want to do. So that's something we don't want to do, because they're on oral tablets for a long time. Offering transfusions doesn't make sense to us. So that's one thing which has been a little bothersome. I don't think any of us have seen MDS, but we keep thinking about that and we keep talking about it in meetings, 1 to 2% of MDS rates. But on the whole, a well-tolerated drug if we are careful and if we monitor our patients well. So I think with this, I will conclude. I thank all my panelists. It's been a very excellent discussion, and I hope all of us have come to some conclusions of how we are going to use PARP in first-line setting for our patients. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Amit sir, can I request you to just see the chats if there are any comments or questions which we can address?
Okay, yeah. So there's actually a long list of things. Okay. So there was a question about which testing first, somatic or germline. Dr. Rahul, if you're there.
Yeah, I'm there. Yeah. I think you've answered it, and we've all been doing it. We ideally do the germline testing for it, because what we understand it, not because of the ease of it. This is very important for the genetic counseling also. So probably one of the roles of doing a germline testing, apart from planning your therapy, also is genetic testing, and that is the first thing probably why the BRCA came into the picture, and everything else was later. And the ease of doing it, the blood, and it's cheaper. So we do the germline testing first, and then probably somatic. I know I saw the question on the chat box saying, why not the somatic first? I think we have an
Correct. I think Dr. Rahul has answered that. If you do germline first, then you know if it's hereditary also or not, and then you would do the counseling, which is a very important part, which Dr. Rahul has mentioned. We kind of, in busy clinics, we kind of miss out on that counseling, and we don't all have counselors, and it becomes a little difficult. I would just put one more point there to all those people who used to believe, no, we should do tissue first, because if it shows up, then you are always going to pick it up. But no, the germline testing is much more standardized and validated. So it's an easier test to do germline first. You will not miss out much more. When you rely on tissue, the tissue technology goes a lot on what depth you're covering and what all you are doing, whether it's NGS based, whether you have added MLPA or not. So in tissue, you may sometimes miss BRCA. So don't do tissue. If you're doing tissue first and if it comes negative, please don't stop there saying it's negative. Please do the germline also. And that's the same thing we say vice versa. So if we do germline first and it's negative, we always say do tissue also. So always when you're doing germline, also remember add NGS, add MLPA also, because MLPA may have about 5 to 7% of patients will be missed. So, and when you do tissue, please see what depth of coverage they are. And sometimes that's going to change from lab to lab and you're going to miss out on it. I myself have at least 3 patients who we did tissue and tissue was negative, and we did germline, we got the germline. So clearly we miss out on tissue because of the way the technology of NGS is. So please ask for both. You can choose a sequence or you can do both together, as nowadays many labs do. Dr. Satish has asked, is there any other test other than BRCA and HRD in our clinical practice? Dr. Sood, any other tests apart from BRCA and HRD do you advocate?
Actually, we go ahead and do the entire panel. There's something that the core diagnostic does, is that GeneCore Predict they do. So it's a test that takes a turnaround time of 36 days. And apart from the BRCA, they tell you about the other mutations also. Probably something which is closest to the HRD I can think of at this time. So gives us a little more information than the BRCA, and that is what I do.
Right. We get all the other genes and they get the information. The only issue is the scoring numbers, and that's the tricky part in practice. We don't know that, but that's the way we move forward. There's a question from Dr. Annapurna that our BRCA mutant population is 25%, so why maintenance for all? Or max 50%, so why subject to all maintenance? No, I think BRCA PARP maintenance, we are only offering for that 25 to 50%. We are not offering PARPs to everyone else. So all of us in the panel, Dr. Shekhar Patil clearly mentioned, we are not comfortable with the PRIMA data. So we would not give it to the remaining 50% clearly. So it's only the 50% who are BRCA or who are HRD. Okay, so olaparib maintenance, okay. So there's a question from Dr. Ulfat. Olaparib maintenance is indicated for stage 3-4 CO ovary or in early stage patients also. Anyone would take that? Dr. Vinayak, would you anytime offer it to your early stage patients? Okay, I don't think they're there. No, so the trial did it only for advanced stage patients. We don't do it for our stage 1-2 patients at all.
Yeah, just to answer in recommendations, I think ESMO recommendation guidelines, they say they extrapolate the advanced stage disease to early stage disease, and they say because it has shown response, if you have a BRCA mutation positive, especially in stage 2, you can use a maintenance therapy.
Oh, right. Okay, I was not aware of that. Okay, so that's very interesting. So we've not really thought about that for our extrapolation for our stage 2 patients. So that's very interesting, right? Someone asked the cost, and that's done. I think Vinayak has answered that. So any role of PARP inhibitors and new adjuvant in CO ovary in BRCA or HRD positive cases? A very interesting question from Dr. Satish. So there's a clinical trial running. We've heard of one from MD Anderson where they actually, they didn't, the data is still running, but she was talking about it in a meeting and she said, it is amazing. She said that they were treating as only with PARP without any other combination chemo, and they saw very good responses. So they were very excited about it when they were talking about it. But as of now, we cannot do it because it's still in a clinical trial with no reports as of now. So I think with this, I think we have completed all the questions. So thank you again. Thank you all the panelists. It's been an excellent discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Amit. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for all the panelists and Dr. Amit Rothan, sir. And I request Dr. Poonam Patil to give a concluding remarks. Madam, please, I request you.
Yeah, thank you very much to all. Excellent talks, and thank you, Dr. Satish, for giving us such a academic feast as is told. So thanks to all the innovations in science and research, we have now new drugs with novel mechanisms of action, molecular tests, biomarkers, and Dr. Sood gave us a very good comprehensive description about the diagnostics tools available. Then to begin with, Dr. Ravi Divakar gave a very good talk of all the studies for first-line therapy of early and advanced stage ovarian cancer. Dr. Prasad showed us the excellent results with SOLO-1 and Paula study for olaparib and the significant survival advantage for patients with BRCA mutation and HRD positive patients. After that, Dr. Sood gave us these comprehensive coverage of all the diagnostic tools available. And then we had very good case discussions. So I think it was overall a very good evening for all of us. Thank you all. So over to you, Dr. Satish.
Thank you, madam. Thanks all the participants and thanks all the faculty. Those who made this event wonderful. And thanks everyone and event manager for making the event very successful. I request all the participants make this event very grateful and successful, and I'll request everyone stay safe at home whenever I know that the COVID is slowly easing and waiting for a vaccine to take it. Thanks everyone. Thanks. Good night.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
you.